the prevention of family violence. It is such a privilege to simply have the opportunity to speak to you ahead of the Leading the Way in Workplace Safety and Respect webinar that is, of course, taking place today. I do want to acknowledge the leadership of Shirley Ann Varney from the Sexual Assault Support Service, and also Michael Bailey and the Tasmanian Chamber of Commerce and Industry in delivering this really timely and practical session. Creating safe, respectful workplaces is not just the right thing to do, it's a fundamental responsibility, and it's actually one that we all share. Sexual harassment and violence don't happen in isolation. They're enabled by silence, by outdated attitudes, and by cultures that look the other way. As business leaders, employers, and colleagues, you have the power and actually the duty to challenge outdated attitudes and behaviours, to lead by example. As the state's largest employer, our government also recognises that we must show leadership right across this area. In recent years, we've made significant progress to promote respectful relationships and gender equality within the workplace and demonstrate a culture of zero tolerance of violence against women through the Our Watch Workplace Equity and Respect Standards, or WERS as it's commonly known. WERS comprises of a set of goals that workplaces can work towards to address gender inequality and prevent sexual harassment and violence against women. And there are 5 areas of focus. They are securing the commitment of leaders and staff, ensure conditions support gender equality, reject sexist and discriminatory cultures, support staff who experience violence, and integrate gender equality into their core business. Attending this webinar today is an indication of your commitment to creating safe and respectful workplaces, and I want to thank you for your willingness to be part of the whole of community approach that we need to address all forms of violence against women. In Tasmania, Survivors at the Centre is our whole of government action plan to prevent and respond to family and sexual violence. It's guided by 4 principles: partnership and transformation, capacity building, prevention and early intervention, and voice and diversity. These principles are just as relevant to the workplace as they are across our broader community. The action plan recognises that prevention starts with awareness. It starts with education and it starts with culture. And businesses, large or small, are key partners in changing the story. Today's webinar will give you the tools and the insights to support your people understand your obligations under the Sex Discrimination Act and foster a workplace culture that is safe, that is inclusive and trauma aware. Because it's not only about compliance, it's about leadership and it's about caring. Every step you take to build a respectful workplace makes a difference. It sends a message that everyone deserves to be safe, valued, and to be heard. So I want to thank you for being part of this movement. And I also want to thank SAS for your unwavering advocacy and practical guidance. Together, we are creating a Tasmania where safety and respect are the standard, not the exception.
Right, so I will now hand over to Lucy Crowley from SAS. Thank you, Lucy.
Lovely, thank you very much. Can I just confirm you're seeing that presentation screen?
We can see your notes screen this time.
Ow, that's not.
Sorry
about that. Let's see if I can get it right before we start.
It always works in the dress rehearsal, doesn't it? That's it, perfect.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for having me today. So I'll just start by acknowledging that I'm meeting with you today from the lands of the Moonina people. I pay my respect to the Palo people across La Chuita and would like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And so thank you very much for courageously joining me today. So we are here today to support Tasmanian businesses in meeting their positive duty under the Anti-Discrimination Act. So this webinar is part of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, as Stacey said, and it's a really fantastic opportunity to reflect on how we can create safer, more respectful workplaces. So my name is Lucy and I am the Manager of Primary Prevention at the Tasmania Sexual Assault Support Service. And our team works with businesses, schools and communities to prevent sexual harm and fosters cultures of respect and safety. And so I just want to also acknowledge that today's content can be tricky and a little bit triggering for people. A huge amount of people have suffered sexual harassment or sexual harm. So just want to acknowledge that experience, and if things become uncomfortable for you, just to use, your breathing strategies or take a break, and that's okay. We won't know if you've stepped away for a moment. So just, if people feel particularly concerned or bring something up for them, I don't intend to go into particularly sensitive information, but SAS does have a 24-hour support line. So it's free. You can ring anytime for counselling support at SAS too. Okay, so our outcomes for today. By the end of the session, I'm hoping that you're going to have a clear understanding of the positive duty and the key drivers of sexual harm in the workplace, as well as actionable steps to prevent harassment before it happens, and also best practices for responding to reports with professionalism and empathy. Okay, so where did we start here? There have been two really big pieces of work recently that have highlighted a problem many already knew existed, and that is that sexual harassment at work is worryingly common. The first piece of work was there's been many, but the recent big ones was the National Survey on Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces, which was done in 2018 by the Australian Human Rights Commission. And that presented data on the prevalence, nature and impacts of workplace sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. And the second was the Jenkins report, which you may have heard of, which has also been referred to as the Respect at Work report in 2020. This was a national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces, led by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins. That was a legal and policy review which made 55 recommendations to government, employers and institutions to better prevent and respond to workplace sexual harassment. These found that more than 40% of women and 26% of men have experienced workplace sexual harassment, which is a huge number. So the law has now shifted around sexual harassment in order to actively bring this number down. So unlike past legal frameworks where businesses primarily responded to complaints, the positive duty shifts the focus to prevention. Employers must now take active steps to prevent sexual harassment before it occurs, not just to react when something goes wrong. So despite this new positive duty, 40% of workplace leaders are not aware of their new obligations. So in Tasmania, largely under these legal frameworks, and these frameworks have been strengthened, as I said, recently as a result of the new positive duty, whereby businesses now have to take reasonable and proportional measures to eliminate sexual harassment. So what we mean by reasonable and proportionate is that this is a scale up, scale down, depending on the size of your business. And so I'm hoping that the things we talk about today are applicable for big and small businesses, even businesses with just a few people in them. So what is sexual harassment and what does the law say? So how can we identify it? Sexual harassment is noted there in Section 17 of Tasmania's Anti-Discrimination Act, and it's any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature where a reasonable person would anticipate that the person being impacted or targeted would feel offended, humiliated or intimidated. And this could be a one-off incident. It doesn't need to be repeated, and the person being harassed does not need to object in the moment for it to qualify. So what does sexual harassment look like? It can be physical, verbal, or through any communication medium. Physical conduct can include some of the more obvious conduct, which I won't, read out, but there are a few that people might not consider, like unwanted hugs, brushing up against someone, standing too close to them, invading their personal space, cornering somebody in an enclosed space. Some of the less known verbal conduct might include sexual jokes or innuendo, comments about someone's body or sex life, making suggestive sounds, whistles or remarks, and other non-verbal conduct might include staring, sharing explicit images or memes, displaying posters or screensavers with sexual content. This can happen through in-person, over the phone, on social media, on messaging apps, Teams chats, even through body language during a Zoom meeting. And that might seem strange to you, but I just went over that one this morning with my team. And there are a few of us who have had things coming up on Zoom and team meetings, which have been rather interesting and, you know, potentially fall under this. So it is important to know that that is also one of the mediums that we look at in terms of where conduct can be shared. So here we can see some of the most common forms of sexual harassment found during the national survey. In terms of who's doing this, the survey found that men are the harassers in over 80% of the incidents of workplace sexual harassment. So this was true for both men and women who are harassed. And that's not to say that most men are harassers. It is not to say that. It's just to say that most of the harassers are men. So I hope people understand the difference there. And I'll be touching on that again later as well. So what's key is that the intention doesn't matter as much as the impact. So even if someone thought it was a joke or a compliment, or if it made somebody else feel uncomfortable in a way that meets the legal threshold, then it can still be harassment. So the National Inquiry, or the Jenkins Report, found that sexual harassment was being justified or excused because it was acceptable to behave in this way, or that the harassers were from a different generation, and so they don't know any better. They were quotes. So many businesses are supporting 4 generations of staff, with an emerging 5th generation hitting the workforce now. And whilst the impacts of sexual harassment and harm have always been significant and known to organisations like us, many of us in the public or in our workplaces or people that we work with are still uninformed about that. And lack of awareness tends to play into cultures that condone and support harassing and discriminatory behaviour. So let's have a look now about how culture drives sexual harassment. And we'll have a look at the pyramid of sexual harm. So this pyramid shows the most serious forms of sexual harm, like harassment and assault, that appear at the top. They don't actually occur from nowhere. So they're actually supported by a culture where less severe and still harmful behaviours are normalised. So let's think about the base of the pyramid as the foundation. This base includes things like sexist jokes, dismissive attitudes towards gender or diversity, compliments that focus on someone's appearance instead of their professionalism, objectification, where someone is valued for how they look rather than what they contribute. And so, for example, a seemingly light remark like, hey, you should dress like that more often. That's great for client meetings. That might be intended as a compliment, but it reduces someone to their appearance and can make them feel uncomfortable or undermined. And when these types of behaviours and comments go unchallenged, they signal that disrespect and objectification is tolerated. And that creates a work environment where more serious and overt sexual harassment becomes more likely. This is why prevention efforts must focus on this lower part of the pyramid, on stopping those everyday behaviours that might seem small, but collectively contribute to a culture where harm is able to occur. And so to do this, workplace leaders can educate staff about these behaviours, create a culture of calling it out early, ensure leaders are modelling respectful behaviour all the time, and make sure that all opportunities, pay, perks, that they're provided equally and not just by gender. So let's examine some of the behaviours that actually, so I'm just looking at some real life cases here for you so that you can see how they've been applied in the past. This was Taylor and August Pemberton. This was a recent case under the new legislation, so it's a 2023 case. And in this case, we're going to explore some of the sorts of things that can constitute conduct of a sexual nature. So this case saw the highest amount of general damages awarded in a sexual harassment claim. So in this case, the complainant, Miss Fiona Taylor, was employed by the respondent company, which was a small business that traded and manufactured jewellery. Mr. Simon Grew was the company's sole director and the manager. And the acts that Mr. Grew engaged in are on the slide. Now, the court had to look at all of the rest of the behaviours and what constituted sexual harassment. And so the court found that, of course, the physical touching was a clear conduct of sexual nature, but they had to decide whether the non-physical actions were sexual harassment. So they found that the gift giving and the expressions of feelings, though not explicitly sexual, still constituted unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. His actions made her feel uncomfortable, no matter what his intentions. Victimization was also found because Miss Taylor believed her job was dependent on her receiving the gifts, and that she could not report him because he'd threatened to charge her with stealing if she reported him. So Miss Taylor was awarded total compensation of more than $267,000. So you can see that acts that are not overtly sexual in nature independently, yet with the situation and the context, the court found that they were, in the circumstances, sexual in nature. And an employer has an obligation to understand the context in which sexual harassment occurs and what drives it and what makes it more likely to go on without detection. An employer or even an employee might wonder, well, what are these circumstances? If someone accepts a gift, how do we know it's harassment for them? And so for the answer to that, we need to discuss the drivers of sexual harm, which start with power structures and how they influence workplace sexual harassment. So sexual harm in the workplace is not random. It's driven by and hidden by power imbalances. So hierarchical structures where employees are more likely to experience sexual harm and feel less powerful and unsafe reporting sexual harassment. And as I mentioned previously, workplace cultures that tolerate inappropriate behaviour, jokes or comments that normalise harassment. Lack of accountability. So when policies exist, but they're not enforced. Gender inequality and discrimination. So workplaces that lack diversity and inclusion often experience higher rates of sexual harassment. Now, this doesn't just mean employing people at equal rates. It's not actually about that. It's how people are treated once they're at work. We'll have a little look at that later as well. So now we know that power structures within a workplace are inherent in the manager and subordinate relationships. But what we need to understand as leaders is that there are more factors than just reporting relationships or managerial relationships that create power imbalances. So let's explore these. This slide gives a good visual on power structures in society, and these power structures also play out in the workplace. So the way power and privilege works is that those closer to the centre of this wheel hold power, and those on the outside tend to hold less. So if you as a person occupy the characteristics or experiences closer to the outer layer, then you have more combining or intersecting vulnerabilities. And this intersecting vulnerability doesn't just statistically increase the likelihood of experiencing sexual or gender-based harassment, but it also makes the impact worse. So, for example, a migrant worker with a disability is more likely to experience sexual harassment, but also may not have the same supports in place or the confidence or awareness to report it. And so they may experience sexual harassment for longer and then have obstacles to support, report, and recover. This is named intersectional harassment in the newly released Work, Health and Safety Gender-Based Harassment Code of Conduct, Code of Practice. So that's really newly released. I'll just repeat that. And it's in our resources. But it was only released in March this year. So it's the Work, Health and Safety Sexual and Gender-Based Harassment Code of Practice. And so look, if you're only just coming across this sort of understanding for the first time, it can be hard to digest quickly how each of these elements impacts someone's power to engage in or resist sexual harassment. So it's thus, a key part of our workplace training is to support participants to really get into the shoes of someone else and imagine how it might be for that person. So let's say a person is on a temporary visa. They might have a large family relying on them for a living, and they may have no recognised educational qualifications in Australia. And let's say that person is given a gift from an equally or even a lower paid colleague who rosters their shifts. And you can see there are various ways a person can be vulnerable to even an equal colleague's power at work. Just look out for positional hierarchy. So look, we can encourage company and people leaders to actively model respectful behaviour that challenge ingrained gender norms and power imbalances. Model a workplace culture where everyone can feel safe and valued. So for leaders, this like stating your support openly. So talking openly and publicly about your support of active bystanders. So for example, if you've got a policy that that encourages people to come forward if they see acts that could be sexual harassment. And so lots of employees are putting up posters now about if you see behaviour that could be sexual harassment, don't ignore it, report it. So if you have those sorts of posters up or these sorts of conversations are coming up in your workplace, make sure you as a leader are talking publicly and openly about your support of active bystanders and saying, I'll support anyone that decides to take action against sexist or sexually harassing behaviour if they see or hear it. So as a leader, you can include voices as well that are typically quiet in meetings. Amplify those voices. So if a staff member who may have intersecting vulnerabilities is being spoken over in a meeting, or someone else is taking credit for their ideas, strengthen the voice of that person. You can say something like, hang on, John, Yasmin was making a point. Spend time publicly thanking or highlighting the contributions of workers in lower level jobs and those experiencing any of the vulnerabilities in the wheel, the outer area of that wheel in the diagram. This is actually really powerful modelling that influences staff around you to take interest in and care for workers from all backgrounds. Spend time getting to know your staff at all levels from all backgrounds, including their names and using them. This includes your cleaners, your admin staff. Part of this modelling behaviour is actively ensuring that you don't perpetuate actions that reinforce power structures and culture behaviour or a culture or behaviour that fosters sexual harm. So you can flip gender stereotypes. Do that whenever you can. Ask some of the men to organise the catering or to clean up after the meeting, and ask junior staff to open up a meeting. Just by way of a personal example, I would like to share a moment that really struck with me, that's something I witnessed in a previous workplace that showed the power that leaders have in impacting workplace culture. So I was at a workplace where our executive manager had recently become a parent, and his wife had gone back to work in a casual role. It was far less senior than his in another organisation. And one week their child became unwell. And what stood out to me was that he took time off to care for their sick child. And he was the manager of around 60 staff. And this was a high pressure organisation dealing with crisis and trauma. And what made it truly impactful was how openly and intentionally he shared his decisions about that. And he told us words to the effect of, I'm not expecting my wife to be the default parent. Her work matters just as much as mine. We're both committed to caring for our children. And just because my role is more senior, it doesn't mean her career should be the one interrupted. And that moment has stayed with me because that was modelling, especially as a senior leader. And he was modelling that private roles and workplace value are not gendered. And to think about just what that messaging that sends to the whole workplace, to parents, to emerging leaders in these Tasmanian businesses have incredible power to shape culture through everyday choices and their verbal and non-verbal messaging. And this is you acting on your positive duty. But on a cultural level, there is acting engine here waiting to be called into action. Anyone, especially people identifying with characteristics closer to the inside of that wheel of power, so people that hold power, they can be really impactful, intervening to stop sexual harassment and improving respectful culture. And what we know from the research is that people are largely actually really uncomfortable and unhappy in disrespectful workplace environments. So let's give these people some definite actions to support their value of caring and equity. And I want to assure men here, whilst I said that nearly all sexual harassment, whether directed at men or women, is perpetrated by a man, most men are not interested in that sort of culture. And calling on them and others in the centre of the wheel of power to enact their good values is evidenced as being a really powerful way of reducing sexual harassment. Bystander intervention methods and training are key in our programs at SAS, but for anyone that can't get along in our training, where we provide detailed bystander strategies, I've included in the resources a great little package that was created by the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation, which can be applied by you in your workplace as well. So it's important for staff to be equipped with a range of bystander methods that they can implement in the moment. Then that these types of interventions are broad. So they suit all types of personalities and power levels, not just the extrovert centre wheel of power holders. So the most unobtrusive action can encourage concerns just to be documented and reported. That requires no speaking out at the time, but just make a note and see if it's part of a pattern. Or more direct methods that call out the harasser in the moment. So for example, if you overhear a co-worker making a sexually suggestive joke in a meeting, you can call it out directly. Hey, let's keep it professional. That kind of joke's not okay here. Or you can direct or diffuse. So I'm just giving a couple of examples here, but we're just sort of surface level. I'm having a look at these. So distracting or diffusing, if you hear something that doesn't sound respectful, you can say, all right, let's get back on track. What was our next agenda item? So those sorts of things just let people know that you're not interested in carrying on that conversation and that you want to get back to what work is about. And checking in after the meeting. Check in with the person who the joke targeted. You can say things like, hey, I noticed that joke earlier. Are you all right? And if you're feeling courageous, you can educate people in the moment. So you can say things like, look, it might not seem like a big deal to you. That kind of behavior is exactly what we're trying to stop. So happen and there is sexual harassment in your workplace and somebody's going to be able to talk about it, you really want to encourage that because not having a good first response is one of the main reasons people cite as not wanting to report sexual harassment. So what can we do when sexual harassment or assault is reported? Trauma-informed response has a significant impact on the healing and the recovery of the impacted person. That's statistical, by the way. We've got stats on the impact of recovery. And at SAS, we've created this memorable acronym, which is ELEVATE. And we offer an entire training session on this. And we provide actionable steps to support someone who's disclosing sexual harassment or harm. So I won't go into it in great detail, but I'll just give a quick overview here. And this is in your resources, so you can take this away. But if we follow this method, it ensures that affected employees feel safe, supported, and heard, and are much more likely to go on to healing and recovery. So our steps include listening without judgment. This is as a brief overview. So believe and validate the person's experience. Even if the story sounds confused or inconsistent when retelling it, that's actually a really normal effect of a traumatic incident. The first time someone is bravely speaking up about an experience of harassment is not the time to question and document all the minute details. This can come across as disbelieving, which is the number one reason people don't disclose in the first place. So ensure safety and confidentiality to make sure you're minimising any further harm for the person, so the harm stops with you. Provide access to support. So this is where there are many different types of support for someone impacted by sexual harassment, whether it's medical exams, counselling support, police support, or support for them, other than being able to tell you about it and have a safer workplace. The important part here is that you're guided by the person disclosing. What do they want and need right now to feel safe? The risk in the workplace is not their concern at the moment. So when in the first disclosure, you're just supporting the person who has come forward in a trauma-informed way. And this, as I said, this type of response is statistically impactful on a person's ongoing recovery and engagement in further supports after they leave your office. So when sexual harassment does occur, and when it's not reported or when it's not responded to well, then the impact the person can suffer is significant in all areas of life. And at SAS, because we also offer a significant amount of counselling, we see firsthand the impact on individuals. And this can include indecisiveness, confusion, underperforming at work. And that can lead to interrupted work or termination of someone's entire career. Longer-term effects can include post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety and depression, suicidal thoughts, and substance use. Impact on relationships are common and significant, as well as leading to social isolation. And look, that's just the individual. Beyond this, we recognise there's a much wider cost associated with the sort of culture that allows or condones harassment. And the impacts go well beyond the 1 in 3 employees directly experiencing the harassment. A recent national survey found that 83% of women and 67% of male employees would consider leaving a job if the workplace did not take sexual harassment seriously. So we encourage businesses to actively improve their work culture to be inclusive and respectful, not only because we know it improves workplace culture and happiness at work, but because respectful and supportive culture improves attraction and retention of your employees. Workplace sexual harassment impacts productivity and profit as well. So there is a pocket and bottom dollar need here as well. So Deloitte estimated that the cost of productivity and staff to be 3.8 billion in just 1 year in Australia. And those costs come from lost productivity, made up of absenteeism, where employees take leave due to the stress or the trauma associated with harassment. Presenteeism, so reduced efficiency when an employee is at work but unable to perform at the usual capacity due to psychological impacts of harassment. And of course, staff turnover, which is the departure of employees who choose to leave the organisation to escape a hostile work environment, leading to costs related to recruiting and training replacements. So every time you lose someone in your team that could have been your next potential best star, you have lost them because they experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. And that's a real loss to your business. Okay, so it matters for your reputation, your staff attraction and retention. But if one of your staff members engages in sexual harassment and your workplace was not actively working to improve culture, to prevent sexual harassment and improve reporting and investigation processes, then there's an additional layer of costly responsibility. Vicarious liability. So vicarious liability means that an organisation can be held responsible if someone in their workplace sexually harasses a colleague, client, or even a contractor, if the business owner or manager, even if they weren't involved. And this is because, as we've been saying, the law now says it's not enough to say, we didn't know, it wasn't our fault. Because while we know you can't control the person completely, you can control your workplace systems and culture. So that is what leaders are being called on to influence to the best of their ability to prevent vicarious liability for them. So taking those proactive steps is what protects both your people and your business. Let's look at an example where an employer has been held accountable for the conduct of its employees, even though it had anti-discrimination policies in place. In this case, the court found that the policies they had were not being shared or utilised to actually prevent or respond effectively to harm. So the case is Hopper and Mount Isa mines. Mount Isa. I lived there for a while, so I can understand why this case may have come about. This was a relatively early decision under the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act. This was 1991, but the case involved persistent sexual harassment and sex discrimination against a female apprentice mechanic that was working in the mines. The company argued that it had policies against discrimination, so it shouldn't be held vicariously liable. But in this case, the male workforce received no training prior to the entry of the first female apprentice. They had posters and photographs of half-dressed women pinned up around the workshop and the training areas. In group training sessions, supervisors and co-apprentices made demeaning comments about this person's ability to handle mechanical work because she was female. Performance reports signalled out her gender as the reason for any perceived shortcomings, rather than critiquing her technical skills and effort. She was routinely excluded from core hands-on rotations, for example, working on diesel engines, welding, or hydraulic systems that her male colleagues all did. It was because of her gender. And instead, she was often relegated to light duties like cleaning up and running errands, which did not count towards her apprenticeship competencies. And the judgment noted the failures of management to do anything to prepare the previously all-male workforce for the entry of a woman and to act on the high attrition rate of females to that point. The company failed to communicate policies effectively or to respond to complaints when they were made, and they were found to be vicariously liable. And the commissioner in that case dismissed the company's argument that Miss Hopper did not complain while she was in employment, and they found that she had good reasons for not doing so, including fear of victimisation. And this decision was upheld in the Court of Appeal. So it's not enough just to have policies buried in a 40-page document that if they're not commonly known or visibly enforced. So let's go back to the solution. This framework here has been laid out in the Respect at Work guidelines. And so this gives you a bit of a framework to work for to implement the new positive duty. And it gives 7 guiding principles and standards. Sorry, guiding principles on the right and 7 standards on the left. And they're not does encourage organisations to get creative, on the scale of your business. Just keep in mind the guiding principles. So on the right, we're talking about what to consider when looking at the areas within the framework. So consultation, talk to your workers about what they need for a safe and respectful workplace. And if you're consulting about whether sexual harassment is appearing in your workplace, or you're doing a survey, try not to use general terms like have you seen sexual harassment or have you experienced sexual harassment, because as we've explored today, many people don't know what that is. And so you have to be really explicit about all the small and minor ways that sexual harassment can play out. And when we know that surveys do that, they get much higher reporting rates that are sexual harassment in the workplace than workplaces that just ask whether someone has seen or experienced sexual harassment in those words. So acknowledge intersectionality when you're, as a guiding principle, when you're looking at the 7 standards. So do any of your workers have differing intersecting identities that may affect their experience of discrimination or harassment? Make sure you're aware of that. Be person-centered and trauma-informed. So support individual choice, safety and dignity, and avoid causing more harm when you know if that something might have occurred already. So the 7 standards are a framework just to help organisations and businesses determine practical actions that they can take to eliminate relevant unlawful conduct and to satisfy your positive duty. So by using this framework, organisations can demonstrate the multiple ways they've actively tried and continue to try to combat sexual harm in the workplace. So just again, ensuring that you don't just have clear policies and procedures, but that you enact them and you model them. Ensure support is visible and staff are regularly trained. The main point is that organisations need to be able to demonstrate just the multiple ways they've actively tried to combat sexual harassment. I sound repetitive, but this is just the message that people just, if we keep talking about it, it will be easy to remember. So, but also preventing sexual harassment isn't just a legal requirement. It's about leadership and creating a safer, more successful and attractive workplace. What do we mean when we're talking about clear reporting pathways? So a clear reporting pathway is something that's expected under the positive duty, and it needs to be a pathway that people can report concerning behaviour, whether they see it or experience it themselves. It needs to be accessible to everyone, so it needs to be simple and in clear steps and plain language, or language that your employees can understand. And it needs to outline how to make a report, what happens after the report is made, timeframes for responses, confidentiality, and who will be told. Ideally, it will be written and talked about regularly. Again, not just buried in a big policy document. And this matters. If you don't understand how to report or think nothing will happen, they won't come forward. People should have options about who they report to, not just their direct supervisor, in case that supervisor is involved or involves someone else in power, and the direct manager may not feel safe, like the safest person to go to in that case. So options might include, if you have the luxury of having an organisation, an HR or people and culture manager, or a designated respect contact officer, and it might be that person that gets the training. And a written report outlining, a written reporting online pathway. So that can be an option. That is not a requirement. It's just an option, particularly in small workplaces where people don't know who's safe to go to. You can have an anonymous reporting line and with an option for follow-up. Because what you want to know is whether it's happening, even if you can't necessarily find out who it came from. There's a risk in your organisation, you want to know about that. So supporting trauma-informed first responses, so making sure that those people that are receiving disclosures are listening without judgment, validating that person's experience and avoiding re-traumatising a person who comes forward. So this matters, again, because this is going to shape the healing and recovery journey for that person. And if you want to retain people, that having a supportive response is going to retain somebody in your workplace. So make sure you follow up communication with the person who has made the report. Make sure they are kept in the loop about what is happening. They don't need every detail, but they need to know as things are proceeding and what the next steps are, when they can expect a response. Make sure they know what support is available. So whether you've got EAP, counselling, adjustments to their workload or their team for a while. They need it. Don't adjust that person's role unless they want you to, because that has been a common experience with complainants and victims, that they get shifted rather than the harasser being shifted. So just be really aware of that, please. And the constant communication to the person who's reported matters, because silence equals stress. Even if an investigation is underway, regular check-ins show care and maintain trust. And build in protections against retaliation. So clearly communicate that any form of backlash or discussion or gossip or excluding people or even actions of demotion are not okay, and they'll be taken seriously. Leaders can actively monitor for signs of retaliation and check in with the person who has reported. And again, this matters because fear of consequences is another one of the biggest reasons that people stay silent. So we're coming to the end of this particular information session. So I've included some resources here, and we're going to be sending those out to people who have registered. But whilst this is the end of this particular webinar, it's just a foundational conversation and one that should definitely not stop here. So please, you can reach out to us at SAS or utilise the resources that we're going to be providing here, and know where to get support. There's a lot of free guidance out there. I know Stacey and the TCCI can support you. There are lots of free guidance, tools and advice available from TCCI, Equal Opportunity TAS, the Respect at Work website, WorkSafe TAS, and don't forget the newly released Code of Conduct. That will be sent out as one of your resources as well. And if you've got any questions, we're going to be back on the 1st of May to wrap up Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And I know that this discussion is sensitive and that Tasmania is a small place and it can feel vulnerable to ask questions, but we really want you to feel safe to do that. So we've opened up an anonymous survey link where you can submit your questions with no identifying information, and we will answer them at our next webinar. And so, yeah, I hope that has been helpful for you. For having me.
Thank you, Lucy. That was super informative. And we've just had a comment, if there's any chance we might be able to get the slides from today's session as well, or even just the power wheel.
Yes.
Is that something you're able to share?
Yes, I'll check about the sharing of slides, but if not, we can do it on a temporary link. Yeah.
Beautiful. Excellent. And I'm going to push in because I really want this question or these two questions recorded, and then I will stop the recording. So we talked about all of the things that businesses should be doing. Have you got any specific recommendations for an organisation without a HR department, like really small businesses? Any sort of top tips for them?
Yes, great question, because it can be a bit overwhelming to think, we don't have big policies and we don't have an HR person. So look, it's just demonstrating that you are trying. So be aware of the framework and the areas that you're expected to be demonstrating positive duty. And you can just have a conversation. It's not just a policy. So sit down with your team, talk openly about respectful behaviour, what it looks like in your workplace, ask how people want to be treated together, what are our boundaries, what will we do if something goes wrong. And like it's really powerful for leaders in small organisations to show the Office of the Anti-Discrimination Commission, they've got a reporting link. And you can say, look, if you need to report something that I'm doing, you can report that too. Like I want you to know you're supported. And so that is powerful leadership. You know, how safe will someone feel if their leaders are saying that, even in a 2, 3, 4 people business? And so agree how to raise your concerns in that business. So it might be just agreeing on processes, using that external format if you want to. And write down the notes that you make at those meetings and put up the slogans that you said that you would do. Put them up on the wall, let people know that this is what we agreed to. Regularly review those things that you agreed to, so it doesn't have to be a formal policy where you paid thousands of dollars to bring somebody in. These are the ways that you would show that you've demonstrated, your attempt to meet the positive duty. And of course, leading by example, so making sure that you're not buying into the culture that perpetuates or condone sexual harassment or any type of discriminatory behaviour.
Great.
And
Thank you. Sorry.
Small business, get onto those supports there where I said, where can I get help? Have a look at those. Yeah.
I think Joe's got a question. Joe, do you want to ask a question?